Sangoniambe. Fly, 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 bird fly, fly. Yoniambe. Oh, fly, 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 bird fly, fly. Yoniambe. Fly, 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 bird fly, fly. Yoniambe.
Thank you. Those were the fresh sounds of the rock band from Kwamashu, and they go by the name of Zulu Rock. Please, would you give them another round of applause? All right, now getting straight to this evening's program. The first panel takes on a kind of interview format between Ireland-born, US-raised political economist and writer, Patrick Bond, and this session will be facilitated by the founder of the Zubera Institute for Research and Development, Xolani Benedict Dube. This session is entitled Writing the Historical Moment. Please could you welcome Patrick Bond and Xolani Benedict Dube to the stage.
What we wanted to do, Nako, is to give some mood music and a few ideas with a film. It's 5 minutes. Hope you enjoy it.
This is home. This is where we live. This is where we're brought up. And it's a community. There's not many places in South Africa, in Durban, that you can feel at home with your own neighbors, where your neighbors are not just people that live next door, but they become your family.
The South African government and its parastatal, Transnet, believes that there's a need to import more goods, bring in more bigger ships, the Panamax, into the Durban harbour, and thereby bringing in over 20 million containers and making Durban the gateway of Africa.
They're now planning to do expansion of the port, which is breaking now our culture, our community, where we have to restart life all over again.
They don't talk about houses, they don't talk about anything, they just tell us that they're going to move us here, they want to dig a port. That's what they're telling us. It's even better to stay in the shacks than living on the road, because I think we're going to end up on the road.
It's really making us angry. We were living in Mayville before, that's Kaitamena. We were forcibly removed because of apartheid. Now they want to relocate us to where? I think we are the forgotten people.
Moving us away is a convenient way to get rid of us so that the problems cannot be dealt with. And that is why relocation is not the option for us.
They can bring the port, it can work for them, it's not going to work for us. Unless we can only benefit if they can employ us.
The container port in Durban only employs 800 jobs. What's more important is that the local manufacturing industry that really created jobs and employed people, that has been destroyed. All we're going to be doing is importing. It means that the local manufacturers will be under severe pressure and they'll have to close down eventually because they won't be able to cope with cheap labor currently in China and India.
I think the Chinese are wanting to learn from South Africa about the way we do business, and we want to learn from Chinese. And I've seen networking. Every corner of this ICC here in Durban, you see people getting together, talking, networking.
Details need to be created in creating the development bank. Leaders of the BRICS nations are highlighting their success in forming a business council, all in the hopes of boosting trade and investment between the countries.
BRICS is basically Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS was formed after a lot of research by Goldman Sachs. The idea was to exchange goods and to develop a bank that they would have control over. Our concern about that sort of thing becomes that the BRICS countries will lead to economic devastation on the continent.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, Africa's open like bullet holes in my cap. Something you should know. You're dropping bricks from above, we're bringing bricks from below.
Bricks from Below is a civil society concept which includes a partnerships between the South Durban Community Environmental Line, Groundwork Friends of the Earth Africa, and the Centre for Civil Society. The container port that's been proposed for Durban to expand will lead to 20 million container and trucks on the Durban roads and community roads. That will lead to more deaths.
Yeah, the climate angle on this port petrochem expansion is terribly important because Durban hosted the COP17, the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was December 2011. We had 35,000 people descend on Durban to try to fix the climate. But we called it not COP, Conference of the Parties, but Conference of the Polluters, because the key negotiators, like the United States, as well as South Africa, China, Brazil, Russia, India, these big powers came not to solve the climate crisis, but to sabotage any binding agreement. And what the Durban port expansion does is just simply amplify the disregard of the climate that we saw at the COP17, because frankly, if you look at the environmental impact assessment work by consultants like the CSIR and the other private firms that Transnet have hired, it's climate denialism. They're just not taking climate seriously.
From a beautiful vegetative area, it's become a hub of industry, noise.
The aroma of Merebank, that's what we call it. You do. You may get the smell, but I don't.
Between the two refineries in Merebank, you are suffering massive health risks because the primary school that's right between them, Settlers Primary, has been recorded at a 52% asthma rate, the highest recorded ever in the world.
So Melissa was born in another area and she doesn't wheeze. But my other two daughters, Maria and Marsha, were born in Merebank and they are chronic asthmatics. Merebank suddenly became a place where leukemia and cancer was in increase. And we realized it is because of the pollutants that have been pushed into the air that has affected our people.
We need to detox, not retox, that part of South Durban.
So we want to ensure that our livelihoods that we are involved in as poor people in this country, in South Africa, is defended, is advanced and protected. If need be, we need to fight for it.
When the blood still dries, my editor tells us not to criticize, cause they're bringing us a boom like industrialized. But we don't want more construction, corruption and drama. Eyes still wet from the tears of Maracana. It's another power block, fuck all change. 99% plain and the 1% gain. If they are guilty, they must pay. If they are guilty, if they are guilty, they must pay. They must pay. What you know about building blocks and blocks that won't build? What you say about bricks that build and bricks that never will? What you know about these building blocks and blocks that won't build?
Xolani, thank you for chatting with me. Xolani is an ANC comrade from way back. I don't know how this is going to go, but let's try it out.
You know, I'm not used to sit like this and talk. I'm used to stand up and shout Amandla before anyone say anything. And really, I'm under spotlight. But anyway, let me welcome all of you and say, really, I'm deeply humbled that the Center for Creative Art, I think they thought that I'm one of the people who are supposed to match my mentor, Professor Patrick Bond. And I think I'm in a dilemma because being an ANC, I'm an anti-establishment. And that's why ANC, they say, is a broad church. And so I'm one of those who are really radical, and you know that I'm a Trotsky. And so I'm very radical. And so to talk to you, Patrick, really for me is a privilege. But before I proceed, I have to acknowledge one of my former teacher who's here. While I was doing grade 5, yes, we were in a class, and then we saw police, the vans were all over the school. And it was a private school. And then they came into our class, and then we never met. We never saw him again until some few years back. And so he is here amongst us. And so when we discuss the issue of UDF, the issue of transition, I would like also to bring him in.
Tell us who it is.
Let me, I was taught when I was young that I must not point people, but I will do it. Babletla, can you stand up? He was arrested, and you were also on the hunger strike, and he was confined in a solitary confinement. And so he's one of the guys who really knows what to fight the system. And so let's come to our discussion today. We are going to structure our discussion in 3 levels. We are going to start with global, go to Africa, the continent, and then we will end up here in Africa, Nkandla. And so
I think we could use a slide or two to assist
use
us.
The slides because we have structured our discussion. We need not to say it. The world is in a mess. When you look at your Russian Today, your CNN, your Sky News, your BBC, your ECNCA, your SABC, there's only one thing that they are telling us, but in different languages and in different ways. They agreed that the world is in a mess. But Patrick is always saying is the issue of the economic system that is prevailing in our universe. And how do you interpret the global capitalism, Patrick?
Great. Well, thanks, Xolani. And maybe a slide will help me out because I'm not the only one to argue for a new way of looking at things. We can go to the next slide. The problem really is capitalism, and we've talked about it in vague ways, but the specific mechanisms are contradictions deep in the core of the system. And so I was trained as an economist, Xolani, regular bourgeois economics, but it seemed to me in the early 80s, when the third world debt crisis broke, that the macro picture was going to be very uncomfortable for a good many years because they couldn't sort it out. You know, they would talk about the 1%. We're than the 99, I think nearly everyone here. And the 1% has been really, since 1987, I think I'd say that's their last great moment. Maybe others would like to dispute this. You'd be very welcome. I think that year, does anybody remember something called the ozone hole? And there was a problem with the chlorofluorocarbons, right, when we were doing our underarm deodorants or refrigerators of the old style. And they gave off CFCs. And the world elites realized, oh my God, there's a huge hole opening up. And especially with my skin, you're going to get, big cancer problems. So they actually solved that problem in 1987 at the world level by banning CFCs. And that meant governments coming together in the UN, Montreal Protocol of 1987, and by 1996 they stopped the production of CFCs and stopped this worsening of the ozone hole. That to me, Xolani, was the last moment the world elites, the 1% kind of put their heads together to address a global problem with a global solution. Now since then, what have we had, everyone? In the late 80s, 90s, this philosophy called neoliberalism based on a Washington consensus where free market economists went wilding. And then in the 2000s, especially after that 9/11 attack on the US, was neoconservatism. I think with Barack Obama, it's some fusion of these ideologies. But it's meant that every opportunity, such as a global capitalist crisis from 2008-9, they've really just been throwing money at the problem. When they stop throwing money, quantitative easing, they taper, they slow that down. Hey, when we get hit really hard, maybe we could hit the next slide, because it does raise the question,
yes.
well, can we do anything, not as the 1%, but as BRICS?
But you know, Patrick, when you talk about neoliberalism and when you talk about capitalism and so forth, we always look at the West to say these are the systems that have been created by the West. But recently we saw the South countries coming together, as well with those who are historically being seen to be more radical on the socialistic sphere or space, and they form what you call it BRICS. And immediately we saw you and the others are taking such kind of formation. Why?
Yes, the BRICS met here, and you saw a little bit of the scenery of protest exactly a year ago. It was the 25th, 26th of March. And it was so interesting. Did anybody in the House pay attention? Did you get down to any of the events? You couldn't get into the ICC, but at Diaconia we held a BRICS from Below summit, a counter summit of civil society and a lot of uncivil society, let's be frank. And so we were thinking that this big collection of the rising powers who had much higher GDP growth rates and were beginning to play a major role in multilateralism. You know, the year before, in 2012, they bailed out the IMF with $75 billion. The IMF needed money from countries that not that long ago were basket cases. Russia in 1998, Brazil for many years, South Africa. These are sort of new conditions reflecting, as Lula, the Brazilian president for a long time, he said, a new economic geography was born. But you know, we looked into it a lot more and we found every one of those countries, I mean, India had just had a horrible rape and the masses of people were up against the patriarchal and the traditions of misogyny in India. And then in Russia, they'd had huge protests against the dictatorial tendencies of Vladimir Putin. Later on, of course, Brazil erupted because of first public transport increases, and then Sepp Blatter, who is like he did here in 2010, ripping all the Brazilians off. China has nearly as many protests as we do per person. Now, that just means these BRICS are very top-heavy, but from below, it's very exciting. If we go to the next slide, Xolani, we then learned later in 2013 that the BRICS were slowing down. And the Economist magazine began to call them, some of them, 3 of them, the Fragile Five. The Fragile Five included South Africa. We're the leader because our currency crashed the most last year, along with India and Brazil. And then earlier this year, not just because of Ukraine and the tensions, partly because oligarchs are getting worried, the Russian oligarchs, and that means Russia's under threat. They had a stock market crash. There may be sanctions now because of their imperial looting of Crimea. Then in China, slowdown, the big bankruptcy last week, slowdown in trade. Things look pretty rocky. And that means they may have a last gasp site to accumulate, which we learned about, unfortunately, because the Central African Republic, remember the car problems we had? That was exactly a year ago. We had a couple of hundred troops there, and 15 came back in coffins the day before BRICS started because they were defending Johannesburg businesses, according to Sunday Times, Mail and Guardian. Chancellor House, the ANC investment arm, had some deals. Francois Bozize, the dictator, and Thabo Mbeki in 2006 had been trying to monopolize a diamond market. And that was, in a sense, a reflection. Maybe the next slide captures it.
Sorry, Patrick, before we go to the next slide. I think in your narrative, you are showing us that it seems as if the world is reaching a dead end in terms of innovation of economic systems. Because as we are saying, the NATO, the so-called NATO countries, they are also inhuman equally to those that we were saying possible they might save the world, the BRICS. And so before we move to that slide, what do you think is the way forward in terms of economic system for the universe or for the world?
The claims, especially of our foreign minister, Maite Mashabane, and some of her advisors, I'm thinking of Eddie Maloka, people who have had a little Soviet training, the claims to be fighting imperialism, to be, as Thabo Mbeki named it, global apartheid, to be defending Africa, that's the right rhetoric. And it may well be possible in this context, as the Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez before he died, or as the Ecuadorian leader Rafael Correa, Bolivia's leader Evo Morales, they're experimenting with what can be done by challenging power, by going against these legacies of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and fighting the contemporary process of neoliberalism. How would you do it? I would say there are lots of opting out approaches, putting on exchange controls against big corporations. There are reforms, let me call them non-reformist, that would undercut the logic of this awful international capitalism. It's quite interesting because Africa was the site for quite a long time. I mean, since certainly I moved to Zimbabwe in 1989, and here in Durban in 2004, we had with our convention center many meetings, the first AU gathering in 2002, dedicated to saving Africa. We have a homegrown KwaZulu-Natal head of the African Union, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, great rhetoric. The next slide suggests, however, that what the BRICS want is a seat at the table. This is an awful image, isn't it? And so when we put these on little stickers all over Durban, created a little bit of a controversy. It seems to me what the BRICS countries are doing in Africa, and I have a special issue of Pambazuka that I co-edited with my colleague Khadija Sharif that's out tonight. If you look at pambazuka.org, a great e-zine for Africa, it's really about looting and sub-imperial alliances with Chinese, Indian, Russian, Brazilian, and South African corporations just as voracious as the Western colonial era corporations and contemporary multinationals. And
so meaning that the global politics or the geopolitics globally, they've got some serious ramifications for so-called the southern countries, and especially here in Africa, because you are saying that the scramble for Africa is still in progress. And to confirm that, if you have noted that yesterday, Transnet signed about a 50 billion deal with the Chinese company for the Chinese company to supply South Africa with the locomotives. And so...
Can I stop you there?
Yes.
Because let's just connect the dots very quickly. The reason about 50 billion rand has been dedicated to mainly buying the Chinese locomotives is because a year ago, 50 billion rand was lent to Transnet, $5 billion roughly, it was 50 billion rand, by China, by the China Development Bank. Now, what's the purpose of that? It's to get coal from Waterberg out to Richards Bay, and from there to China. Now, just make the connections. You know the Waterberg and Lephalale is where they're building the biggest power plant on Earth, coal-fired power plant. It'll be the third biggest when it's finished, but it's currently the biggest under construction, 4,800 megawatts. And do you know what's happening with these Medupi, it's called, and Kusile? And there's also a coal 3, the 3 big coal-fired power plants. It means that our climate situation, and especially contributing coal exports to China, is going to be absolutely impossible for our targets of cutting 34% below business as usual for emissions, and we're one of the highest emitters because of this huge coal. But just connect the dots, Xolani, because I don't think anybody else is in the media, and the dots are that when there's so much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, our air becomes more humid. And then did you see what happened in Mpumalanga and in Limpopo? Huge storms, 2 weeks of rain. And that's coal that's getting wet. In fact, it's coal dust that when it was delivered by a company, BHP Billiton, our KZN major electricity consumer for its aluminium smelters in Richards Bay, it's delivered to the Kendall plant in Mpumalanga, but it's soup, right? So they can't use it, and they clog up the boiler. And what happens to us about 2 weeks ago, exactly what? 7, 8 hours national load shed. And to connect the dots that ESCOM is responsible for the climate change more than any institution in Africa, that then gives us this rain, and then screws ESCOM, a kind of climate blowback is hard to do. And I'll just say that in the next slide, it helps illustrate why that awful map of Africa as a piece of raw steak has to be cooked to be consumed. And this is where it happened. This is the climate summit where it was confirmed in Copenhagen in a deal linking Jacob Zuma, Lula, Barack Obama, Wen Jiabao, the Chinese premier at the time, and Manmohan Singh. And they agreed in Copenhagen to fry Africa, to cook it, because they wouldn't do emissions limits that were binding, and they agreed on a kind of carbon trading strategy to let the bankers solve the problem. Bizarre. But this is the sort of set of contradictions now that the 1% have got themselves into.
And so meaning that this 8 or 3 trillion budget for infrastructural development is just a mirage, it's not a reality.
Unfortunately, if it's a reality, we're all sunk, and Durban will sink fast because we're so close. The next slide gives you a sense of the second biggest project. The first biggest is the Waterberg rail link to Richards Bay. That's about 300 billion. The 250 billion South Durban shipping and petrochemical expansion, which, by the way, does everybody know, it began by rerouting the petrol pipeline that used to go through Kloof and Hillcrest, where you live, right?
Yeah.
You people are powerful because you rerouted it right through Umbumbulu and South Durban. And so it was 6 billion, and it ended up being 23 billion rand. So that's Transnet, doubling the capacity. So those of us, I live in the Bluff, those of us in South Durban are going to be just totally, hypertoxic.
And there's a commission on that pipe because
big
of
construction
the prices,
corruption. Now, what that means is a dig out, and any of you from the South will know, because this air will be filled with dust for years, for decades, and they want to bring it from 2.5 million to 20 million containers. Guys, just don't bring those over Fields Hill on the trucks. But unfortunately, those locomotives are for coal, and they're really not making any progress, as far as I can tell, looking as hard as I can, to get the containers in South Durban off the trucks and onto rail. That's what we need to do. The next slide just shows you how toxic my neighborhood is. We call ourselves Africa's armpit. It's a nice slide here, but let's take a real South Durban. Next one. That's what South Durban is. It's just amazingly saturated with pollutants. You saw a bit of that on the film. And I'll just end the South Durban piece, if I might, with the next slide, which encourages all of you who are concerned to come out to the Louis Botha statue just down at Che Guevara Road, where the DUT Biko campus is, and march on City Hall next Saturday. Will all of you join us? I hope you will, because that's very important to show the South Durban people, especially those right at the coalface of pollution that you care about, cleaning up this damn city.
Patrick, I'm gathering that in your talk that it seems as if you are an internationalist, and knowing your class background, and in South Africa, the issue of skin pigmentation being such an issue, why you dedicate yourself in such a very depth adventure?
That's such a good question. I found myself learning so much and becoming more fulfilled in having any kind of aspirations to racial equality 30 years ago, when I was growing up and becoming politically aware, and made visits here in Durban, and I was mentioning outside Praveen Gordhan, one of my teachers of revolutionary Marxism at the Phoenix Gandhi ashram there. It was a fantastic time. Now, the next slide will tell you why, looking in a mirror, I feel just as terrible as Paulus Zulu in that poignant discussion, or Adam Habib, of a sort of class privilege. If I've got 10 confessionals just the way they did, so just writers, bear with me, this is like researchers, but it's also writers, right? You have to be aware so much, especially postmodernists have told us, of positionality. So let me run through 10 sins that I commit, and others like us, and our Center for Civil Society. We've had lots of problems in getting a good formula in which we learn from activists as we study them and their struggles. Sometimes our academics, let me run through these 10 points, are guilty of gatekeeping, of finding a little social movement or a labor struggle and just hijacking it and controlling it and taking some sort of political ownership. The second is something that, if you're a Trotskyist, you know what I mean. It's called substitutionism. It means that you have your vision, you put yourself and your ideas out there and expect them to fit. And if they don't fit in the mass democratic sensibility, you substitute them in. And maybe the third version of this is even worse. It's ventriloquism, right? In which you sort of are maybe doing press statements, or you're helping craft research that tells a story and substitutes your voice, and you're then a ventriloquist. And you've got their local phrasing, and you're bringing in your international theory. That I do that from time to time by mistake. My fourth sin is careerism, and that's a parasitical problem. And I confess to this a lot because I learned so much, Xolani, I think others who are researchers at our university do, when, for example, you see activists who struggle against the big pharmaceutical companies to get AIDS medicines. They had to struggle against Thabo Mbeki and against the US government and against the World Trade Organization, against Bill Gates's control of intellectual property, because that's the way to make money. And when they did that, people like me were humbled because I didn't think the balance of forces could be overcome. And I was so educated. One of my doctoral students is Vuyiseka Dubula, recently the head of the Treatment Action Campaign. Wow, they taught me so much because I just said in writing, it's very embarrassing, that they were going to lose because of this adverse power balance. And then they won. And it seemed to me an epistemological breakthrough at the site of conflict, where these researchers, like me in our armchairs, think that we can observe big structural political economic processes, but they're there at the point of conflict, at the heat site, and there's a lot of light, and they see that, and if they're self-critical and strategic about how they understand their involvement in a power battle, those activists can be exceptionally powerful intellectuals, organic intellectuals. Adam Habib challenged us to do some Gramsci. So just think of Gramsci's idea that the activist is producing knowledge, and therefore, as we're trying in our center, to say, well, maybe there's doctoral level production of knowledge, an epistemology of a praxis that with my careerism, I'm embarrassed that sometimes I act as a parasite, and these folks are really the ones. 5 more quickly. Technicism. Ugh. Legalism. Some of us do rights talk. Oh, take your problem to the Court. The Constitutional Court will solve everything. This Constitution is so good. We've tried that, and that's been embarrassing too. Divisiveness, favoring different fractions and people within these movements. Hucksterism. I have done that sometimes. You just, romantically promote this movement, or maybe you're ANC, and you think, okay, this is the most important single social process. Settling scores is the next one, importing our own little internecine rivalries and sort of battling it out with some other petty bourgeois academic. We have a problem also, the next one is called the failure of analytical nerve. There's a whole thing called the BRICS Academic Forum, and they all suffer this. They won't say anything cheeky about BRICS the way we tend to do from BRICS from below. And that inability to really draw out the full implications can be scary for a petty bourgeois academic. I think some of you writers, you probably often question, can I go that far? Some of you like to break the boundaries. The final one is betrayal, where we often are in a position where maybe a consultancy emerges, maybe something comes up that we're under pressure. Will we betray these social movements that are providing us so much rich information? And we're often guilty of these sins. I commit a couple of them every week. I have to be very careful. So.
Yeah, I think that was all about...
We're doing confessionals at this time with the writer for better imagining.
I think this was all about the global politics. Patrick is so fond of the laptops. I remember once, book launch that I hosted where there was Suresh Roberts when he attacked you about your laptops and so forth. I think now we have to go to the next stage, because I can see people, they think that Patrick speaks in tongues. And so,
it's true.
And so now we have to remember that you are in a free-spirited environment where we have to communicate. And we are coming home now. Unfortunately, we have seen the rising death in our country. And one of the perpetrator, or the main perpetrator of that, is our government. And the most deploring or the most shameful massacre post-apartheid is the Marikana massacre. Well, what's your take on that?
I think we could look at Marikana in a certain geographical context in the next slide. What Marikana represented in August 2012, and what a series of subsequent processes, the Farlam Commission that's regularly unveiled new shocking behavior by the police, the collusion of Cyril Ramaphosa, soon to be our deputy president of the country, a 9% owner of Lawman. You heard it last night, I think, in a very eloquent way from all of the speakers, Ben and Adam and Paulus. And I thought it would be interesting to follow up, so I went up there to look around, especially for some evidence of what was underlying processes. So two things I'd just like to communicate. One is the role that women played in the reproduction of a politics of strength. And the women are not often given credit in Marikana, but it was exceptional that those men stayed up on the hill 3 more weeks after the massacre to get their 22% increase. It was because women were exceptionally important in this. They even had a march of 800 women alone, from Nkaneng Township to the Marikana police station. And they did that even though their leader had just been killed. Her name was Paulina Makushlu, and she was an ANC councillor. And then the police went and shot up the place one Saturday, and she died of the wounds. Now, the politics of women in the reproduction of labor there goes back, of course, to migrant labor. And so we learned so much from Marikana about how these systems of super exploitation, where mining houses don't just kind of take from workers at the point of production. There's a whole big, wide system. And we found that out again in these other places that are exploding in January. Do these names mean anything to everyone? Places like Mothodlong, where 4 people were killed just demanding water. Their water had been cut off, right? And it turned out Edna Malewa lives in Madabeng. Madabeng's this big municipality that's right next to Pretoria, and she lives in Hartbeespoort Dam. And Hartbeespoort is beautiful and has lots of water, but she didn't know that just over the hill, in all these little dorpies that were exploding with service delivery protests in January and February this year, and more people were being killed, that the national department could pop in and override the Constitution and solve the problem. That really struck a lot of us. And the Mercury and I've had a little debate, the local newspaper. They wrote a piece saying, we can't do anything. The government's just unable to resolve. Well, actually, Edna Malewa came in and solved the problem in Mothodlong overnight. She brought in her managers to turn on the pumps. And the provincial minister, Thandi Modise, went into this Majikaneng, and she turned the water from a platinum mine over to the township. And so there are moments when areas like this, with unifying struggles, actually come together and force politicians to do things. Now, it may be that we need an election every few months to get this kind of awareness by the politicians. Oh, no, we're going to lose right next to Pretoria because of this hatred. And the EFF, certainly Malema, taking full advantage of this. If we go to the next slide.
No, before we go there, Patrick, I can see that one.
It's very shocking.
Yeah.
We all have to remember this.
There is a move currently in our country after the Nkandla Nkandla Gate or Nkandla whatever, where people are saying we have to impeach the president, Zuma must move from his office, and on the other side, there is also the Marikana Commission. It seems as if we value the issue of money compared to life, because it seems as if the public is quiet. And we have not heard anything from DA, we have not heard anything from EFF, we have not heard anything from anyone. But about 40-something people were killed, as you can see, lying them there. And no one is saying we have people that are supposed to be held responsible. How do you reconcile the two?
It just means that the fantasy that we heard from Adam Habib, I love Adam, he founded our center, he's a great guy, but he did tell us that we should have a social compact. And that means getting the accountability to make changes at that very top level. Imagine asking Cyril Ramaphosa to fess up about the money that he's making from lawnmen and all of the other really dirty deals that he's done over the years. Some of them are very, very dirty. And then change things. They've got too much invested. In Kandla, the African and Kandla Congress, sorry, that's just a mean way to talk about your party there, is so committed. Like, it reminds me, I sort of learned my politics in Zimbabwe from observing a kind of exhausted nationalism. It has to stay in power. The next slide really is the challenge that Ramaphosa, that Trevor Manuel have presented. Is a national development plan the way to do that system of accountability so that we actually redistribute wealth and create jobs? So little of that document is appealing to the masses. The next slide shows you what we saw. It was May Day 2013, but also yesterday. You may have seen several thousand red-shirted metal workers out on the streets in a strike against the National Development Plan and its youth employment strategy, as well as the finance minister, joined by community groups from all over Durban. And this was happening in every one of the major cities. 7 cities had big strikes. And it was over the demand to bring back a freedom charter, a reconstruction development program, instead of what the 1% seem to be offering here, which is more of the same and maybe liberalized labor markets and more competition in the world. And that's just not working. Those are the big analytical problems. And the strategic question, as you are asking, I think we should probably go to Q&A in just a moment. Strategic question is a united front the route for this configuration of disaffected masses of people, the thousands of service delivery protesters, the metal workers, the alienated intellectuals, all of us who would rather see a better system, a fairer society?
Okay, before I conclude with you, it seems as if within the social movements there is a serious cleavages that are there. When you look at the poor protest that is happening in Cape Town, is mainly spearheaded by so-called young black activists, and we have not seen the social movements supporting such kind of act or supporting the grievances that these people from Kailicha and so forth are raising. Why there is such a silence from the Abahlali, Basemjondolo, the landless and so forth?
Well, they're not silent. They're obviously active on every front. I have full respect for Abahlali, Basemjondolo. There's the shack dwellers movement here, and they've had assassinations of their leaders just over the hill, Cato Crest, last June, where the mayor and the MEC for Health, Mayor Nkamalo and MEC Dlomo, are absolutely implicated in inciting an assassination. It's on our website. You can track back to a big rally that was held where these two politicians were after an ABM leader. It was really awful.
Are they supporting the poor protest?
I don't know. This tactic is interesting. This is what they call number 2 for number 1. And this is number 1 in the Western Cape in her Mercedes. I just wonder if we maybe bring the lights up a little and ask you what you think. I don't know what Abahlali or other groups will do tactically, but whether this is the kind of non-violent civil disobedience, although this is aimed at a car, not, okay, maybe there's a person in the car. You really learned about this tactic when it hit the N2 highway between Cape Town Airport and the city, or it hit the provincial parliament in the city, or especially when it hit the single most important site in Cape Town, the airport. And the lobby in the airport was also messed by the feces flingers. And as a result, they got change. I mean, it was extraordinary that Helen Zille and her provincial team really quickly moved in and found, okay, where is the problem? What can we do to solve some of the sanitation problems that lead Andile? That tactic 100 years ago might have been used, or similar tactics, as Mahatma Gandhi in this very province, in Newcastle, developed Satyagraha, the truth force nonviolent civil disobedience strategy. And when he developed this tactically in India through the Salt March and many other sites, and people like Saul Alinsky, who I sort of learned urban politics in that tradition in the United States, they would sometimes, certainly Alinsky, use scatological weapons. It was often all that people had. If it's done not against human beings, but against property, I find that quite attractive as an alternative to what we see, including in Cato Crest, that led to that assassination, which is burning council offices or burning municipal libraries or what have you. I mean, these are the sorts of, I think, tactical questions that I hope the activists who are way, way more committed and at stake than I will ever be, I hope they begin to develop, because I think that's quite an exciting innovation to say my body, the sort of biopolitics, can be part of a solution if it raises the stakes so high that it becomes, for politicians, quite frightening to be on the other side of that.
And so meaning that this is the nuclear weapon of the,
of
the poor.
It could be. I don't know if any activists in the room want to take this. We will be having, for example, in about a week, Zaki Ahmed and the Kailicha Commission to look into police violence will be doing workshops here at our center. So there's lots of ways in which activists in this united front approach, as it's called, you see the metal workers were in a big A alliance, an alliance with the ANC and SACP and what do they call it? The Congress of Sweethearts and Trade Unions. I think they're going to throw out the metal workers, Xolani, and it's going to be renamed the Congress of Sweetheart Trade Unions. And that leader, Xolani Mavavi, was here in Durban yesterday. And it does raise this kind of question, can a small A alliance emerge with all manner of strategies and tactics, hopefully aimed at taking what tend to be popcorn protests that pop up, fall back, and have no coherence, no clear strategic implications, no politics, and actually begin to knit together like 30 years ago, a united democratic front that can challenge class apartheid. Maybe we should throw it open and see what people think.
Okay, and now thanks a lot, Patrick. I would like to open the floor and the flood of questions can come. But see, yes. May you introduce yourself if you don't
This
mind.
man needs no introduction because you saw him on the film.
Yeah, but...
Hola. Hi. I'm Ewok, and I'm a rapper, and I work with Patrick. And I just wanted to bring up two things. You mentioned, Xolani, that with the Americana, that there didn't seem to be any overt sort of political interest from parties like the DA and the EFF compared to the response to Nkandla. But the EFF essentially launched themselves and used Americana as a launching base for their platform. And is it not something to do with the fact that the DA doesn't really have anything too much different to offer in terms of economic policies than the ANC? They want to use the same sort of trickle-down effect, but the EFF is the only one that's actually really talking about any sort of structural change, and that's why Americana becomes such a fertile base for that, because the whole process was based on the whole system needs to shift at some level. And just to comment on that, because I do think that the EFF definitely stood out from any other political party and used Americana as a flag. And then, Patrick, the idea of like language in the country separating all of these popular protests around the country, the fact that Western Cape farmers might not speak the same language as Americana miners, how much of a problem and how much of an issue that we need to get over? Because we know that language is coming up again and again, especially at our tertiary and our education institutions, about the idea that people, if they are raised from a very early age to respect and even to be able to use fluently and be able to deal in daily lives in their mother tongue and in other mother tongues and respect and whatever, it's a unifying force that we've seen. And how much of a problem and a barrier is it to unifying the popular social movement's language?
Yeah, we can maybe take one or two more, but actually a very quick answer to Ewok is that Julius Malema seemed to have been one of the catalysts, along with Mashinistas. Mashinistas forced these workers into such desperation that they really were out on strike because the garnishee orders hitting their salaries, their paychecks, wiped them out, and they needed the 22% increase they won, 12,500. So the language question, maybe, Ewok, for Western Cape farm workers who won earlier in February of 2013, an increase from 59 to 105 rand per day. The language was a language of extraordinary victory by Americana workers who were so brave after 34 of their comrades were murdered, 78 injured, 270 arrested and charged with the murder by this crazy National Prosecution Authority. And in turn, that wildcat wave that we witnessed between September 2012 and mid-2013 in Toyota down here in South Durban, in the transport sector, the food workers, the vineyards, all of the country seemed to be absolutely incredibly enraged at the inequality and the lack of buying power, especially after the machinistas, these loan sharks, hit you. And it's in that sense that the World Economic Forum did these surveys. It's the Global Competitiveness Report every year, and the South African working class named again this year world's #1 most militant working class. That's the common language, I think. Yeah, give it up for the working class of South Africa, gold medal. I don't know, some of you are enthusiastic, others might be more nervous, but.
Could we please go back to the slide of Marikana? And please allow me to render one poem out of the poems that I have. This gentleman is going to read it.
And you can say your name for us, bro.
I am Andile Ndlovu. I'm going to read a poem written Marikana by Sikumbuzo Tlaka. I smell trouble, a wildcat strike. It's been days, it's been weeks. I'm sitting on the sofa, minding my own business. The afternoon is turned into a disaster. Marikana, oh Marikana. Why another Sharpeville? Why are we counting corpses again? Bodies piling up on the drenched soil, drenched with the blood of protesting miners. Was it worth it? Genocide on my soil again. Nelson Mandela is still alive. He has turned into a victim again, witnessing the brutal carnage in his last days. Silenced and numbed by the infirmities of old age. The trigger, happy police have done it again, except now it's in a new dispensation. Marikana, why are you quiet when you are about to be slaughtered? Why are the heavens with the power of thunder? Why don't you chase the workers away? Where is the warning when a miner is about to be executed? Where are the warnings? At least the cry of the birds. Marikana, did you really deserve this? Fratricidal carnage, as I observed on the television. Black policemen with complete armor, defenders of Western imperialist capital in Africa, killing their own brothers in cold blood, a dastardly act against manners of my own blood and soil, killed and maimed for asking a slice of surplus value. Policemen, why are the merciless killing of your own people?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the, yes.
Kevin Moore. Patrick, where's the relationship with the Kuha port? Because I heard once that that would be the main port where everything we import and export will be going through. And then now you're talking about this airport being made into another port. So does it render the Kuha port a white elephant?
Hey, we are breeding a herd, and I just love that poem because my mentor here has been Dennis Brutus, who passed away in 2009, but he was a regular here at the time of the writer. And there's in the Poetry Africa a special day, Letters to Dennis, and Ewok was a Letters to Dennis poet a couple of years ago. And Dennis was from PE. Port Elizabeth Nelson Mandela Metro has a new harbor called Kucha that was meant to, as you say, be the next big, in fact they called it the Alexandria of Africa, because it would be the next big site that would transfer these huge mega ships. And maybe we can have, I don't know if there's time for one more, but it just strikes me that this is the epitome, along with our double stadiums, right? Our Moses Mabhida Stadium right next to the King's Park, or our ICC, the biggest convention center in Africa. or our new airport. Some of you have been in and out of the last few days. It's empty, it's a big barn. And in all of these ways, capacity planned is so much lower, sort of much higher than what's been realized. Kucha is now actually nicknamed, I go there once in a while, the ghost on the coast. They're getting a few little projects in, but there was meant to be billions of rands of big investments. A huge smelter was meant to be there as the anchor tenant. Nothing. And it just makes no sense to put the biggest container terminal in this deep port so far from the major consumption centers of Gauteng and Western Cape and Durban. So it may be one day that we could argue that the South Durban port shouldn't be built because Kucha would make more sense. It's a deeper natural harbor. But I'd like to go further, and I'd like to question the import of 20 million containers a year, which will deindustrialize. And you saw in the film all of the adverse effects locally, but I think it also wrecks our soul to be trading that much, to be putting so much into export, so much into import, and not becoming a little bit more self-reliant and balanced and ecologically sensitive and local and lekker. And all of these processes, to me, are about regaining some kind of sovereignty of not just the economy, but it's our culture and the extent to which Western capitalist culture wipes out everything else. Look, I'll just add one last thing I have to say, because this afternoon we had such a good debate at our Center for Civil Society with 4 students. Does everybody know about UKZN? 4 students wrote a letter to the Vice Chancellor, and it was a bit cheeky, but it wasn't particularly mean. And they're now under disciplinary hearings as our freedom of expression is threatened, not for the first time. And it's there that people were beginning to understand the lack of solidarity amongst students to support these 4, and us academics, stems from so many of our middle class students at UKZN just saying, I got mine, I'm in the expulsions or failure to get registered because of lack of money doesn't affect me. It's the individualization, it's the commercialization. In our university, it's breaking down our productive activity into how many units, productive units. By the way, they're not even books, they're peer-reviewed academic articles that I hope we'll all be part of contesting, because it's just not right for us, eh?
Yes, can I take 2 last questions?
Ladies and gentlemen.
It's not upon my discretion, it's upon to the guys who are having the match. And so
I greet you all. Dube is my name. Patrick, I have a question for you.
I'm not actually seeing you, my friend. Where are you? Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, great.
Yes. Concluding from everything that's happening, I have figured that the reason why we're having these tragedies in as far as like the Marikana is concerned and the BRICS issues is due to the lack of knowledge. We perish as people, like as humans. The reason why all this is happening is because of the people that are actually in control of the universe, so to speak. They think that the actual destiny for a human being, it is to have riches, like as in wealth, as in money. So once they get there, you know, like when you have a dream and you want to get there, once you get there, that there is not a there anymore, it's a here. And then you want to get to your new there. So what happens is this, there's people that are in control. They want to get there, like they have a positive dream to actually make a difference to everybody. Once they get there, the attitude changes. They fail to get to a new there, which is to create a positive impact to us as humans. So my point is this. We think that, no, that's the knowledge that we have. Money is everything. We forget the fact that creating a positive impact is more than anything. You know, if we had one person who was a leader that had a dream to actually free us, because they're using, or should I say, they're monopolizing the word freedom to us, forgetting that we've gotten to freedom already. Now we want change. So now we're not getting that change because they're getting everything that they wanted, which is wealth. So how do you think we can actually solve the issue of going beyond money, of being truly legendary, like in the world as a whole?
I have a song by Simple Red. Oh, money, money. I'll give it to you.
Maybe we'll wrap up. I know the next session has to come
that's
after
the
the
last
interval.
question. Thanks. That's the last one.
Hi, thanks so much, gentlemen. My question is for Dr. Bond, actually. We talked a little bit about climate tonight. I'm curious sort of to bring it back global, which sort of apologies because that's not where we just ended, but what do you see as the greatest obstacle as well as the greatest potential for a global climate policy moving forward?
It's a good way to end because I can answer the prior question about the extent to which everything is commodified. Because the greatest obstacle, I think, are do-gooders. Let me throw out Al Gore as a name, who expect, because he's tried everything he could in the Kyoto Protocol process as the Vice President of the US, and he was in Santon last week, and many of our activists went to be in a kind of climate camp with Al Gore last week. And I think the obstacle are people who and institutions. Let me name one, WWF. If you read the Mercury, our local paper, the last 2 days, you've seen the WWF absolutely humiliated because people promoting Durban as a great climate struggle city for the municipal climate policy end up in social media faking names and trying to fake the competition to make Durban one of the great cities of the world. It's extremely embarrassing. But I think with Durban promoting, it's a main pilot project for carbon trading, that is to take the emissions that are coming, in this case in Durban, from the biggest landfill in Africa. Methane comes out, and to capture it and to turn it into electricity at the Bosaso Road dump and sell it to the World Bank and then to international markets. It is the ideology, the same ideology we just heard a critique of, that if you have a market problem, you can solve it with a market. And in this case, it's letting bankers solve the problem. To me, it's absolutely terrifying that world climate policy, as currently constituted by the 1%, will turn over the future of our planet to bankers through carbon trading, and that the South African government firmly supports that. This is an absolute recipe for disaster. It's the commodification of everything, isn't it? The privatization of the air, that you can sell the right to pollute. Luckily, as the book Politics of Climate Justice, published by UKZN Press, will show you, there's plenty of activity from below. And just the way that treatment action campaign defeated big pharma corps and Thabo Mbeki and the US government and WTO and intellectual property in general, and saved millions of lives. You know, our life expectancy went from 52 in 2004 to 61 today. It's amazing. And activists who defeated apartheid. I always get inspired when I look around and when I hang out in South Durban with these activists who can connect the dots and say when Eskom causes rain in Mpumalanga and can't turn on that soupy coal to give us electricity, we should all be learning, and not just learning, but doing, and not leave it to bankers, but to get the state to come in and change our energy system to renewables, our transport system to public, our cities to become more compact and less sprawly, our agriculture to rely less on pesticides and fertilizer, our production systems to be less carbon intensive, and our consumption to be lower and more humane for those of us in the middle class and up. And finally, for our disposal systems to be zero waste oriented. That's the strategy, I think, that brings us away from a carbon addicted capitalism to an eco-socialism, and I think that's the answer I'd give to you. We've had too much in this last 20 years of what we call class snuggle. Time to get back, comrades, to class struggle.
I think this is the we have to sum up with this question. Patrick, what is interesting, we've seen in Ukraine, men in balaclava invading another country, and the whole world is saying, who are these people? No one knows them. Where do they come from? But they were in full arm, and they went to strategic points. And also, immediately after that, the Malaysian air flight disappeared. No one knows where it is. And the Arab Spring is still springing. And there is no end where we think that a new paradigm shift is taking place, meaning that the system is able to mutate and to progress and ravage our souls? That's my last question.
Well, it's impossible to answer quickly, because if we look at the array of forces that are against change, they would include the National Security Agency of the United States listening to every word we're saying through this little phone or the laptop. All the odds are against successful revolutions, aren't they? Yeah, you can turn it off, but they're still listening, if not the NIA. And it seems to me that what they've been able to do is, especially in a place like Kiev the last few weeks, learn from their mistakes in the Arab Spring, which in turn, in a sense, they were taught by Seattle in 1999, activists stopping the World Trade Organization from meeting, and cities like Genoa in 2001. And where you take urban space, which in the manifestation in 2011 was called Occupy movement, where you take that space and you democratize it, you have a right to the city. What we're now probably seeing in Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt, was a tragic manifestation of great democratic instincts to take space, then subverted by extremist religion, by generals, by resurgent imperialism, by quite a backlash counter-revolution. But it doesn't stop us from trying to move out into the streets whenever we can and show that democratic impulses are going to actually solve these problems. And it won't be 1%, and even with Adam Habib's genius social compacts involving 1%ers, it's going to be much different. It's going to be from below, the way we've won these other battles. So we'll see you on Saturday the 29th, Louis Botha, little march down to City Hall, and start that process. Thanks, comrades.
Fly, 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 bird, fly, fly, Union!